Welcome to Tennessee's at-home learning series for literacy. Today's lesson is for all the fifth graders out there, though everyone is welcome to tune in. This lesson is the second in this week's series. My name is Ms. Thompson, and I'm a fifth grade teacher at Tennessee Schools. I'm so excited to be your teacher for this lesson. Welcome to my virtual classroom. If you didn't see any of our previous lessons, you can find them on the website www.tn.gov/education. You can still tune into today's lesson if you haven't seen any of our others. Today, we'll be learning about someone that changed the history of human communication. But before we get started and to participate fully in our lesson today, I'm going to ask you to get a couple things. 1, a piece of paper. 2, something to write with and a flat surface to write on. And 3, a highlighter or marker if you have one around. If not, a pen or pencil will be just fine. I'll give you a few moments to get prepared for our time together. So my goal in the last lesson was to make sure you didn't think electricity was boring. And I think I did a great job. Electricity is totally cool, and I can't wait to dig back in today. So I'm thinking that this is the absolute perfect time and perfect place for us to start our lesson today. So I'm wondering, what drove Bell to invent something like the phone? Did that idea just come out of the air? How did he get from the simple electric circuit, like the one that we drew here, to a telephone? That seems like a really big jump to me. Were there other inventions along the way that led him to the telephone? Okay, this has me really curious. So I think we need to head into the text to find out. I'm going to read about this famous guy, Alexander Graham Bell, to see what we can find out about him. I want you to listen closely as I read because you might pick up something that I might miss. Now, you should have a text at home and you're able to follow along with me. Alexander Graham Bell, 1847 to 1922. So that means, if I do my math, that he lived to be about 75. A long life of inventing, right? What did we find out this time period was called? That's right, the electrical age. Here is a picture of Alexander Graham Bell. Alexander Graham Bell was born in Edinburgh, Scotland on March 3rd, 1847. Bell's parents did not give him a middle name, so he chose Graham. He often went by that name rather than Alexander. Wow, can you imagine giving yourself your own middle name? I think Alexander Graham Bell is already shaping up to be pretty interesting. Bell was born into a very talented family. His mother, Eliza, was a musician and a painter. His father, Alexander, was a speech teacher, as was his grandfather. Bell himself was such a gifted pianist that he could easily have made a career out of it. Instead, he chose to follow his father and grandfather's footsteps, becoming fascinated by the human voice and human communication. We read that Bell's father and grandfather were both speech teachers. That's something we need to think about a little more. What do you think a speech teacher is? What do you think a speech teacher is? Well, let's think about that word speech. It's close to the word speak, right? Speak, speech. Yes, so maybe a speech teacher is a person that teaches others how to speak. What do you think? Does that sound right to you? I kind of like that definition, at least for right now. We might learn more later that we can add to it. So let's really think about this for a second. Bell's mother was a musician, and both his father and grandfather, were speech teachers. I'm thinking that Alexander Graham Bell was surrounded by sound. His mother's music on the piano, his father and grandfather teaching others how to sound out words. It's all coming through his ears as sound. How cool is that? All right, we read that Bell chose to follow in his father and grandfather's footsteps. What do you think that means, to follow in their footsteps? What does that even mean? At first, I also thought it meant that, like them, he would become a speech teacher. And maybe, as we read, we'll find out that he does. But at this point in the text, it just tells us that Bell became fascinated by the human voice and human communication. What do you think that means, fascinated by the human voice and human communication? Right. The human voice and how we use it to communicate with one another was really interesting to him. But the word fascinated is stronger than interesting. It means that this was something that he couldn't get enough of. Sort of like me and chocolate. I would definitely say that I'm fascinated with chocolate. Now, enough about what I like. Let's read some more about Mr. Bell. Bell was a very imaginative young boy. He went to school from the age of 10 to 14 only. Before that, his mother educated him at home. Bell was not a very good student. He was more interested in pursuing his own interests, such as collecting birds' eggs and animal skulls. That's really, really interesting. If he only attended school from age 10 to 14, how many years was that? That's right, just 4. But it looks like his mom educated him at home the rest of the time. Was he a good student? Nope. Why do you think it might have been hard for him to be a good student? Well, we don't know tons yet about Bell, but so far I see him as a kid that is full of inquisitive energy. He's always wanting to know more about the world around him. He probably asks more questions than those around him and have answers for. In short, I think he was probably learning faster than most people could teach him. He wasn't satisfied to sit quietly and listen. He only wanted to figure it out on his own. Maybe this could be why he only attended school for 4 years. Okay, we have a lot of information, and I don't know if you're feeling like this, but I'm thinking we're learning so much information about Alexander Graham Bell, and we need a way to keep it organized. So let's grab a piece of paper and keep some ideas organized that we can write down about Alexander Graham Bell. Now, I'm going to start by writing Alexander Graham Bell on the top, and I'm just going to put A.G. Bell. I'm just going to put A.G. Bell for short. I'm going to put Alexander Graham Bell for short. Please write that down. Feel free to use a marker or a highlighter to make it stand out. If not, just write it in capital letters like I did. We've learned a lot about Bell so far, so I think we're going to have to go back to collect a little bit of information. So I'll lead you kind of along. First, we did learn that Bell lived during the electrical age from 1847 to 1922, which means 75 years on this earth. I'm going to write that on my organizer. I'm just going to write down the dates because I don't need to write down every single little thing. So 1847 to 1922, 75. And we know that what was that time called? That was called the electrical age. The electrical age. We know that for sure. Then we read that he came from a very talented family. Let's write that his mom played piano and his father and grandfather were speech teachers. Mom played piano. Father, grandfather, speech teachers. I can zoom in so you can see that. Now I want to write down under speech, speak, because we did read that in our text. Now, you should have your graphic organizer. We're kind of using bullet points just to list what we've learned about Alexander Graham Bell. Now, remember, we said that Bell was also surrounded by what? Sound. But he wasn't just surrounded by it, he was fascinated by sound. So I'm going to add that on my list of things too. He was fascinated with sound. I hope your organizer looks just like mine. But it wasn't just any sound that he was fascinated with, was it? Right, the sound of human voice, as well as how we use it to communicate. Let's add that too, right under the words fascinated with sound. I'm going to add fascinated with sound, but not just any sound. He was fascinated with the human voice and communication. Your notes looking just like mine. We're just taking notes about what we gathered from our text. What was the last thing we learned about Alexander Graham Bell? That's right, he was not a very good student, and he was only in school from the age of 10 to the age of 14. We learned that he was too busy following his own interest to participate in school. Let's jot that down. Not a very good student, only in school from age 10 to 14. Now, I'm collecting all of my notes. I hope you are too. This really helps. Now we can find out if we want to add more. Bell's father had invented a written code called visible speech to help deaf people learn to speak. So think about it. Bell's father worked with people that are deaf. Do you know what deaf means? Yes, it means that someone can't hear. Either they were born without the ability to hear or they lost their hearing as a result of an illness or an accident. Maybe you know someone that is deaf and know that it can be really challenging to not be able to hear everything that's going on around you. But if you don't, just imagine how it might feel. It's pretty frustrating at times, I'm sure. You'd have to learn how to use your other senses, like sight and smell, to help you in everyday life. So Bell's father obviously knew that deaf people already had challenges that hearing people did not. And he thought that teaching them to speak could be a big advantage. So this code, visible speech, let's learn more about that. In 1862, Bell and his brothers, Edward and Melville, began helping their father demonstrate how visible speech works. In 1863, Bell and his brothers built a speaking machine. Bell had begun his pursuit to invent instruments for human communication. Cool, a code for deaf people to learn how to speak. Let's look at a picture of what Bell's father called visible speech. Let me zoom out for you just a minute. And there's that word again, speech. This is really cool. Can you see how this side of the face and all these images down here, must represent the way sounds are formed in the mouth? Let's take a minute to think about how difficult it would be to make each little step it takes for our mouth, teeth, and tongue to make a sound. Try saying your name really slowly. Say it again and think about all the things your mouth is having to do just to make your own name. That is really interesting. I'm wondering if this is something that Bell's father used with his students. He was a speech teacher after all. I'm thinking this definitely goes on our organizer. I'm going to add visible speech and code for deaf to learn speech sounds, and I want you to add it too on your graphic organizer. I'm going to scoot it up a little because I'm running out of room. Visible speech and the code for deaf people to learn sounds. I think it was cool that Bell and his brothers helped their dad show people how visible speech worked. But even cooler that he and his brothers built, I know, a speech machine. What in the world is a speech machine? I think we're going to have to read more to find out. But first, let's add this to our organizer. I'm going to add a subheading called Inventions, like this, and then I'm going to write speech machine with brothers underneath. So I'm going to write Inventions, and then underneath, I'm going to write speech machine. And you can write brothers if you would like, because that's who invented it. Isn't that cool to invent stuff with your siblings? The only thing my sister and I ever invented was mud pie. Let's keep reading. Determined to succeed, by 1870, Alexander's two brothers had died from lung disease called tuberculosis. He too was sick with this disease. That's awful. His family moved to Canada, where they believed the young man would have a better chance for survival. Having become a teacher of the deaf in London, young Bell did not want to move. But in 1870, Bell and his parents set sail for Canada. Well, that's really sad, and I'm sure losing his brothers really changed his life. And I can see how it would be hard to move. But if it meant surviving the same disease that killed his brothers. We also see that, in fact, Bell did become a teacher, and he taught deaf students. I'm guessing that knowledge he gained from his father and grandfather was really beneficial. Not to mention that he and his brothers had been involved in their own way, showing people how their visible speech code system worked and inventing their own speech machine. Grab your pencil. Let's add to our organizer, Teacher of the Deaf. Teacher of the Deaf. Bell did not stay in Canada long. In 1871, he moved to Boston, Massachusetts, where he began teaching at Sarah Fuller's Boston School for Deaf Mutes. He was a gifted instructor. He explained to his students that sound is actually vibrations in the form of waves. The sound waves enter a person's ear where they cause parts of the ear to vibrate. These vibrations are changed into the electrical signals that are sent to the brain. In 1873, Bell became a professor at Boston University. That is so interesting. Did you know that's what happens when you hear a sound? It sounds pretty complicated, but I think it's neat to know that by then, the late 1800s, scientists understood the science behind how we hear. Bell continued to work on several inventions while living in Boston. His fascination with speech had been accompanied by a study of electricity. Years before, he and his brother had tried to transmit the sound of human voice over a wire. One of the inventions Bell worked on was a new telegraph machine. The telegraph was the first machine that allowed people to send messages electronically over wires. Okay, so let me reread this. His fascination with speech had been accompanied by a study of electricity. Tell me what you think that means. Good job. I'm thinking that the word accompanied means together, so it sounds like Bell was starting to think about speech and electricity together. I want to add that to our organizer, so I'm going to write speech and electricity. Speech plus electricity. It looks like we might have the first inklings of his famous invention. And what was it? That's right, he invented the telephone. We learned that he and his brother had tried to send the sound of human voice over a wire, but failed. Don't give up, Alexander Graham Bell. You're going to make it. But you can't hold the good guys back for long, and Bell kept inventing. What did we learn he invented? What was it called? That's right, the telegraph. And what did it do? Yes, it was the very first machine that people could use to send messages electronically over wires. Wow, so Bell is getting closer to his dream formula. Speech equals electricity. Here's a picture of one of his first telegraphs. Here is a picture of one of his first telegraphs. Isn't this so cool? I would love to see how one works. This might be something I could research after today's lesson, and you could too, to research how the telegraph works. I'm thinking we have some new information to add to our organizer. Where do you think we should add the word telegraph? That's right, we can add it under our subheading Inventions. So let's add telegraph under Inventions. All right, back to the text for more. Bell hired a young man named Thomas Watson as his assistant. One day in 1875, a remarkable thing happened. Bell and Watson had run into a problem. A problem? That doesn't sound good. A transmitter and a receiver on the telegraph they were working on had failed. Okay, these are two words that seem pretty important to electricity. Transmitter and receiver. Let's write them down on our organizer. Transmitter and receiver. Transmitter and receiver. Let's start with transmitter. We know transmitter means to move or send. So this is obviously something that sends a signal. We also know that we're talking about electricity. So I think we're safe to say that a transmitter is an electronic device that sends a signal. Let's add that definition to our word transmitter on our organizer. It means an electronic device that sends a signal. All right, let's move on to receiver. A receiver, this is something that should be easier since the root word is something I'm sure you've heard and said many times before. Yes, you receive. What does it mean to receive something? That's right, to get something. So let's think about it. A transmitter is an electronic device that sends a signal, but a receiver is something that receives a signal. Something that sends a signal, something that receives a signal. Very good. While Bell was fixing the transmitter, the one that sends a signal, one of its parts vibrated and sent the sound to Watson at the end of the receiver, the one that detects the signal. They realized they had the beginnings of a speaking telegraph or a telephone. Wow, I can only imagine how surprising these two were. How amazing. They didn't even expect it to happen. Let's look at a picture of Bell and his telephone. Maybe closer to his dream formula. Yes, I think so. This problem wasn't so bad after all. Notice what they called it. Do you remember? Yes, a speaking telegraph. I challenge you to call someone's phone a speaking telegraph sometime today. Of course, you're going to be asked to explain it, and you can do it. A speaking telegraph. That's something I want you to add on your own right now under Inventions. Add speaking telegraph under the Inventions section of your graphic organizer. Let's get back to reading. An incredible invention. Bell and Watson continued to work on their new device. Soon, Bell discovered a way to transmit an actual human voice. It was an exciting time as the two inventors continued to improve on the design of their telephone. Of course, we knew he'd keep going. Notice it says that Bell and his assistant, Watson, continued to do what? Yes, continue to improve upon their designs to make them better. We've been talking about this concept a lot, and it seems like something important for us to focus on as we learn about other inventors. Bell had to tell people about the telephone and convince them that it worked. He was a good speaker, so this was not a difficult thing for him to do. The telephone was both fascinating and practical. Although some people doubted that it would ever replace the telegraph, in time it did. Bell's original telephone became a standard form of communicating over distances. Okay, so the text says that eventually the telephone replaced the telegraph, even though people doubted it would. Why do you think people living then didn't think the telephone would be as successful as the telegraph? Well, I'm thinking they were used to the telegraph working just fine. They didn't think they needed anything to replace it. I wonder what those people thought once the telephone was the biggest hit ever. Bell did not stop working after the success of his telephone. Of course, not him. He continued to work with deaf students. In 1890, he founded the American Association to promote the teaching of speech to the deaf. He also made improvement to the phonograph, one of Thomas Edison's inventions. Bell called this machine a graphophone. Fascinated by flying, Bell was also working on a flying machine. However, Orville and Wilbur Wright succeeded before he did. Okay, so we just heard another name on our list. What was it? Yep, Thomas Edison. I think it's important to remember that he's living at the same time as Alexander Graham Bell and inventing things out of the world too. We see that Bell had even decided to see if he could build upon Edison's invention, the phonograph. Of course, he couldn't call it a phonograph, but it's pretty close. Do you remember? Yes, a graphophone. I want you to write graphophone under Inventions. I'm just going to write it right over here. I'm writing it right over there. But I don't think we can leave off that the graphophone was an improvement of Edison's phonograph. Now, we can know that after we've been talking a lot about this week, they're building upon other people's ideas. Bell's greatest invention, the telephone, would in time connect the entire world. Speaking of connecting people across the world, let's look at a picture of Alexander Graham Bell when he made the first call from New York to Chicago 16 years after he invented the telephone. This is Alexander Graham Bell making the first telephone call from New York to Chicago 16 years after he invented the telephone. How cool. Bell died on August 2nd, 1922. Telephone service in Canada and the United States was stopped for 1 minute as a tribute to the man who made it all possible. What a great way to honor Alexander Graham Bell. I don't know about you, but I won't think of my phone the same way again. Now, let's put our brain together and get you ready for your independent practice. I want you to look over your notes in your organizer. I want you to look over your notes in your organizer. Now, I'm looking at my notes, and I know for sure he was born 1847. He lived to be 75. It was called the Electrical Age. His mom played the piano. His father and grandfather were speech teachers, speech related to speaking. He was fascinated with sound, human voice, and communication. He wasn't a good student. He went to school for the ages of 10 to 14. And he created visible speech. His inventions created the speech machine, the graphophone. He was also a teacher of the deaf, and he did the transmitter and the receiver. So I'm just going over all of my notes, and you should be doing the same. He had a very talented family that surrounded him. Yes, They were all very fascinated with sound. His mother played piano and his grandfather were speech teachers. He was fascinated with the human voice and human communication. We know that this influenced his life and shaped the things that he would invent later on. We see that, like his father and grandfather before him, he taught people that were deaf and likewise knew a lot about how sound worked, including his father's invention of a code to help deaf people learn how to speak. It was called visible speech. Bell was a real go-getter. He began inventing early in life and made some pretty neat things before he invented the telephone, like the speech machine we talked about and the telegraph. Remember, the telegraph was very important to the lives of people everywhere during this time period. It was the quickest way people could send messages over wires. I also noticed that, like other inventors, Bell worked to improve upon the invention of his colleague Edison. He tried to make Edison's phonograph better and even renamed it the graphophone. More than anything, I remember that Bell wanted to connect his love and his fascination of speech and electricity, and eventually he did. Hence his most famous invention, the telephone. I think it's safe to say that Alexander Graham Bell had an interesting life, full of hard work and great accomplishments. He lived during a time that encouraged this type of thinking, and inventions were popping up everywhere. Let's take some time to think about the path that led Bell to his famous invention, the telephone. Grab a piece of paper and jot down your thoughts as I ask a few guiding questions. Grab a piece of paper. I'm going to ask you some questions. What do you think were Bell's earliest influences? In other words, what were the things in his life as a young boy that may have pushed him in the direction to invent? Why do you think he wanted to invent, and what pushed him to invent? What are some of the things and some of the experiences that he had along the way to keep him craving more? What evidence did we collect in our graphic organizer that proves Bell was always striving to connect speech and electricity? What evidence did we collect that proves Bell was always striving to connect speech and electricity? How does his inventions prove that he was on a mission to fulfill his dream of connecting speech and electricity? How does each of his inventions prove that he was on a mission to fulfill his dream of connecting speech and electricity? I'll give you a few moments to look over your answers. Now, I would like for you to do some independent work. I would like for us to make sure that we've gotten everything we need to know for our independent practice. We just completed a solid review of our organizer notes. Great job capturing so much information. We also took some time to think deeper about how Bell's influences and experiences that led to his eventual discovery that speech and electricity could be combined. His invention of the telephone was one of the greatest inventions of all times. I think you're ready to go. After our lesson is over for today, I want you to take some time to complete another activity. I want you to imagine that you're an inventor, just like Alexander Graham Bell, but you're living 50 years in the future. You've been asked to develop the next generation of the telephone, way beyond the phones we have today. Your boss has asked for you to give a presentation to her product development team that includes a few things. 1, the history of the telephone since its invention by Alexander Graham Bell. This means you'll need to interview others in your home that are older and may remember phones from years ago. There have been many versions along the way. Your improvements, proof that you're building upon the ideas of others. Your own addition. What makes your phone different than anything anyone has seen before? Here's what I want you to do. Use a clean paper to make notes for your presentation. Then be sure to summarize in a few short paragraphs at the bottom. Top it off with a prototype drawing of your new phone. Be sure to reference your graphic organizer for facts and details to support your writing. So again, I want you to pretend you're creating a new phone on your own. I know you're going to do a great job. Who knows? Maybe your new phone will be the next big invention. As always, thank you for inviting me into your home. I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson in the Tennessee at Home Learning Series. Have a good day.